What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria.
Those girls whose greatest ambition was to have a bookshelf with a sliding ladder.
And we want to be your book friends. This is a podcast for the books we just can't shut up about.
Speaking of books we can't shut up about, this week we're reading Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, a mysterious and thrilling and fantastical novel that is impossible to describe, but we're going to do our best in the next hour. And it is absolutely gripping.
Major spoiler warning going forward. I usually welcome everyone to listen to these episodes even if you've read the book, but I would like even just pause to think about it. Do you really want to listen to this episode and have the book spoiled for you? Because so much of the experience is the mystery and the unknown. Mm-hmm. That's all I will say. Okay, if you're still listening now, you have consented to having everything in the book spoiled for you. Welcome.
Welcome. We're so glad you're here. If you'd like to support the show, you can rate, review, and subscribe or follow or whatever the name for it is now on your preferred podcast platform. If you look in our show notes, anytime we link to a book, that will take you to our affiliate page on bookshop.org. And in a few countries, you can buy books with those links from independent bookstores, and we will get a very small kickback that helps us buy books for this show. And if you want to like join the club, join the book club and become a member, you can find us at buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv, and you can join for just $3 a month. You get access to our archived episodes. There's like 50 of them in there. And our film club series where we review book to TV or book to film adaptations, plus a bunch of other stuff. It's a great time. Come hang out.
Cool. So, Piranesi was the book that I saw everywhere in 2022 and heard nothing about. So, typically, to have a book recommended so many times, like on Instagram and Book Talk, and every bookstore I walked into, it was on the like selected table for, recommendations from the booksellers. I was like really impressed. Like, props to the book community for keeping this one spoiler free. Like, usually if you've seen a book around a lot, you like know what it's about. It's You've got a general vibe, you've seen the discourse, you understand, but it's truly a book you just have to experience for yourself. And like, I'm impressed that I made it to literally the last week of 2022. The book had been out for like 2 years by then, and I hadn't been spoiled. So anyways, it was really fun. It was a really great way to finish 2022 for me. Yeah, ending my reading on a high note of the year was awesome. And yeah, I just can't really stop talking about how much I want other people to read it. And I know we'll get into spoilers, but that's my spoiler-free version of how much I liked this book. So if you still are here and you haven't read the book and you are now thinking, I'm convinced, they've said this a lot, I should probably read it first, this is your official warning because Julia will spoil it in about 20 seconds. Okay, what was your experience reading?
Yeah, so my friend read this book on an airplane, like all in one go. And it was sort of, I was like, oh, it looks really cool. What is it? And she was like, well, it's like a guy trapped in a house and you learn things. And I was like, what? I was just like, so, I mean, she's not wrong.
No, that's pretty, it's not inaccurate.
It's not inaccurate, but I was like so confused as to what could possibly be happening in this story. Yeah, like I feel like talk about a lot. I always have so much trouble describing this book because it feels like even picking a particular genre as like dark academia or any reference to Greek mythology or magical realism or mystery, like any element gives something away about what's happening as soon as you start reading. And it kind of ruins the like absolute confusion you experience at the beginning where you're just like dropped into this new world and this new worldview. And So I think that's what I told Victoria. I was like, it's impossible just to describe, but it's good. You just have to read it. That's just what I say. So the way you sort of go on that journey from like, this is a fantasy world to, oh wait, that's just a normal guy with a laptop and now I'm really confused. And then like, oh shit, he was trapped in the literal labyrinth against his will and people trying to get him out, but he doesn't want to leave. And you're just like, you just go on this whole roller coaster and it's really well done. Yeah. Indescribable, but a must read. As I say indescribable, again, we're about to spend an hour trying to describe it.
Well, in this episode, I mean, we usually wait until we get past the next couple segments to talk about what we'll talk about. But if you're like, why should I continue to listen to this episode? Let me tell you. One thing that made Julie and I think about a lot, and we sat on the phone for like 3 hours this weekend talking about it, was just this idea of like how we make sense of the world around us. And this book does an incredible job of giving you the experience of not being able to make sense of something and having to use, it's like such a reader experience of having to use your own understanding of the world and be very aware that you are projecting, or maybe you're unaware like I was, but I became aware that I was projecting my idea of the world into this book, trying to puzzle it together, trying to make sense of the world and feeling like maybe I forgot something, you know, like, oh, did they tell us something that I missed? Am I missing something here? And then the big reveal is that no, your narrator is extremely unreliable because he has forgotten everything. Mm-hmm. And this is him making sense of the world around him. And so that's what we want to dig into in this episode is how do we make sense of the world around us? What is symbolism? We'll talk about art and statues and representation of an idea, things like that. And if that sounds fun, you're in the right place. So a little bit about our author before we dive in. Susanna Clarke is an English writer known for her fantasy novels and short stories. She is the daughter of a Methodist minister, and like myself, she spent her childhood moving around. So she lived a lot of different places, and then she went to Oxford to study philosophy, politics, and economics. I found it interesting. There's a pretty good interview in the New Yorker that we'll link in the show notes. She mentions that she originally went to study history and at one point changed her mind. And she doesn't remember why, which I thought was funny because it's a very like Piranesi thing to do. She's like, I know I changed majors. I don't remember why I did that. After graduating with undistinguished marks, she took several jobs in publishing and eventually left the UK to teach in Turin and then later at Bilbao, Spain. Yes. And during this time, as she was a publisher, when she was abroad, she'd been dabbling in writing some. And she was starting to really get moving on her first novel, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and decided to return home to Britain because that's where it was set, and she wanted to really focus in on the book. But it did take her another decade to finish writing this first novel. During this time, she met and fell in love with her now partner, Colin Greenland, who, in a very like cute, bookish meet cute, was teaching her 5-day fantasy writing workshop that she went to. And Greenland is also adorable, like in quotes about like how he like first perceived her writing. And he was like, they referred to her piece that she submitted for the workshop as like the Austen one, because she's very inspired by Jane Austen, and it comes across in her writing. And he basically said like there was nothing wrong with it. She just needed someone to tell her it was done, which is adorable. He just seems very supportive of her. And so she had published some short stories, but when she was ready to publish her novel, she actually had an unfinished manuscript that she was able to get £1 million advance for from Bloomsbury. Like they were so enthralled with her novel that they were like, we will give you £1 million to finish it.
Wow.
I think that editor read 3 chapters. And I was like, what a gamble. But they were onto something because it did really well. She had a really intense publishing tour for this book in 2004, and early 2005 she collapsed. She had a debilitating illness when she was in Spain briefly, and it came back in like full force and confined her to her home for years. So a lot of her life and her, interviews and stuff she's given has been influenced by her disability. She had many, many years where she was very unable to leave her house, unable to get out of bed. She doesn't really have a concrete diagnosis. Sometimes she's received diagnoses for Lyme disease or Epstein-Barr virus or chronic fatigue syndrome. But it really impacted her writing career. And she knew that when she was getting back into writing, a sequel to Strange and Nora was not going to happen. It was too intense, too much laborious writing and research she would have to do. So she decided to pick up a story she started years before, and that story became the novel Piranesi. So this was published just over 15 years later in September 2020. And of course, it's fantastic. It was shortlisted for a bunch of awards and won the Women's Prize for Fiction. While this story was started before her illness really impacted her life, I think you can see some elements of it too, of someone who's confined to a home, someone who is making sense of the world around them that is limited from what others may experience. So yeah, I found that aspect of her life. And the New Yorker article is a really long interview, and she talks a lot more in depth about how her disability has impacted her writing.
That's such a fascinating. Now I want to do a second episode where we do a disability theory read of it instead.
Julie's throw out the outline. We have a new topic.
Yeah. We'll do a part 2 and say okay, we're going to read it in a totally different way now. Here we go. You can tell we enjoy this too much. Okay. So hopefully anyone who's still here is prepared for some spoilers. And for those who need a refresher, here is the plot. A guy who is calls himself Piranesi is trapped in a labyrinth, which he calls the house. But he's lost his memory, so he thinks it's the whole world. But it's really more of a pocket universe, to borrow a Doctor Who term. And there's an academic who's studying / kind of using him, who Piranesi calls the other. And Piranesi doesn't know this is the guy who trapped him, but we're kind of suspicious, because we can feel there's kind of a power imbalance where this guy has a laptop and seems to be able to leave, maybe, ? He uses language we understand more, there seems to be something going on. And then Piranesi meets an older guy who he calls the Prophet. And this guy says that Piranesi should be wary of a new person who will come to the labyrinth to look for him. And after this conversation, Piranesi begins finding remnants of old journal entries that he does not remember writing, that make him start to question everything about who he is and where he is. And so he starts to be wary of the other and the Prophet, and is kind of intrigued and excited by the presence of this new person, who he calls 16. When he eventually meets 16, whose name is Raphael, it turns out she is a cop trying to bring him back to his family and rescue him from the other, whose name is Valentine Ketterly, and the Prophet, whose name is Lawrence Arnsales, who trapped him there. Also, that Piranesi's real name is Matthew Rose Sorensen, and that name is drilled into my brain. I can't say Matthew Sorensen. I can't say Matthew. It has to be Matthew Rose Sorensen. The other tries to kill him to keep word of his experiment getting out, but the other, aka Ketterly, dies instead in a big flood, which Piranesi knows how to avoid because he's been studying the movements of the water and the tides in this labyrinth for years. And so he knows where it's going to be and how it's going to happen. And then Raphael takes him back to his family, takes Matthew Rose Sorensen back to his family, but he continues to visit the labyrinth from time to time because he misses it. And even though he accepts that he is called Matthew Rose Sorensen in the real world, he never fully integrates those two parts of himself. He has been fundamentally changed forever, and the labyrinth now informs everything about his life. And we end with a return to the sentence that concludes the first chapter, where he says, "The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite."
So as I mentioned in this episode, we want to talk about how we make sense of the world around us. How does Piranesi make meaning in his life, and what that experience is for us as readers. It made Julie and I go off on long tangents in our prep about heretics and the Enlightenment and Western civilization. And there's so many deep thoughts, and maybe shallow thoughts, depending if your thoughts may be deeper than ours. It's all relative. But anyways, we are nerds, and we love symbolism, and we like talking about symbolism. One of my favorite classes in college was literary theory, which many other English majors will say was the worst class they took because it breaks your brain, but I love it. And if you're like, girls, you went way too deep on this book was just a fun time, you can also let us know that, and we'll take in that feedback.
we're sharing what this book inspired in us, which is sort of this contemplation about, how we use certain objects, symbols, memories in our lives to sort of tell a story about what is real, and there's so many different layers to how we understand the world, and it's really fascinating to use this as a way into that kind of conversation.
I love this stuff because it matters so much, right?
Yeah.
We pick up fiction and it's a way to maybe escape. It's a way to maybe think about something different than your own life right in front of you. But I think some of my favorite books are the books that take me out of this world and then bring me right back and reshape the way I think about it. And there's a quote that we'll end this conversation with as well, but I will start it from the book itself, where it says, "Perhaps that is what it is like being with other people. Perhaps even people you like and admire immensely can make you see the world in ways you rather not."
So if we start with the book, then how does Piranesi make meaning in the labyrinth?
So as you read, he starts out with this, I don't know what to call it, almost like core tenet of his beliefs. His kind of mantra maybe is, the beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. Which honestly does not make any sense, especially the first time you read it in the book. You're like, I don't... And he used a lot of capital letters.
Yeah.
So what you're reading in the book is his journals, different journal entries. And so the beauty is capitalized, house is capitalized, kindness is capitalized. So you're like, okay, all these concepts are very important. But what we can pull out of this is that Piranesi recognizes some sort of larger benevolent power that he calls the house. He finds comfort in this. He finds its kindness infinite. If I lived in this house, I would not see it as a kindness that there is only seaweed and fish to eat.
Yeah.
I would be quite bored with the food choices. But Piranesi sees this as a kindness. He also sees the beauty as immeasurable. So he sees so much beauty in the different staircases and the statues in the halls and how different some of the rooms are. And even the rooms with kind of scary statues or the rooms that are dark and he doesn't know what's there. He finds a beauty in these places. He also writes that it is my belief that the world, or if you will, the house, since the two are for all practical purposes identical, wishes an inhabitant for itself to be a witness to its beauty and the recipient of its mercies. So not only is there this larger power of the house, but Piranesi sees the house and the world basically the same thing. And that he himself as an inhabitant is some sort of important thing within this house in order to be witness to all these things. It gives me some real Western Christian vibes to hear him say that. That's what it makes me think of because that's the context I grew up in.
When I remember and I look at quotes from this, I see it as a kind of animism, which is an anthropology term. An animist, I don't think, would call themselves an animist unless they were familiar with anthropology. It's a sort of blanket term for the perception that everything in the world, anything you could come across, rocks, water, birds, the sun, in Piranesi's case, statues, as animated, meaning that it's alive, that it has a spiritual essence, has something to say, not necessarily with language, but through its, existence. Piranesi does believe that these, the items have something to share with them. He watches the birds and kind of interprets their choices like tarot cards in a way. He goes to the statues when he's afraid. It's a little more complicated than just he has one belief system or another. It's very particular to him and his past. But you can see in the way that he interacts with his surroundings as him seeing the world around him and trying to come up with a story that makes sense. Now that he doesn't have any memory of the outside world, any linguistic memory maybe. He has some functional, operational memory, clearly, but no linguistic memory of the outside world. And so he's just he's trying to tell himself a story that makes sense. Why would this house exist? Why is he the only human there? Except the other who's sometimes there. What's he supposed to do? All that kind of stuff. And a big part of that is the statues, because there's tons of them. They cover all the walls. They're everywhere. And he's trying to make a map make a map of them, and he remembers them, and it's interesting to watch how he interprets them, because it tells us a lot about his sort of process for making meaning. He goes to them for advice when he's sort of stuck and trying to figure out what to do. He thinks of them as his friends and protectors from the tides. So as the water comes through the halls, he hides behind the statues. And then at the end of the book, he actually kind of, once he's encountered what we would consider the real world, he makes a reference to how he continues to use the statues as these kind of symbols.
Again, at this point, the narrator is kind of distinguishing himself as Piranesi was the version of him that lived in the labyrinth. The eye is this kind of newer version of Piranesi outside the labyrinth / Matthew Rose Sorensen. He hasn't quite identified who he is now that he's outside. Anyways, he writes about himself. Piranesi lived among statues, silent presences that brought him comfort and enlightenment. I thought that in this new, in parentheses, old world, the statues would be irrelevant. I did not imagine that they would continue to help me. But I was wrong. When faced with a person or situation I do not understand, my first impulse is still to look for a statue that will enlighten me. And later, there's an example where he writes, people were walking up and down on the path. An old man passed me. He looked sad and tired. He had broken veins on his cheeks and a bristly white beard. As he screwed up his eyes against the falling snow, I realized I knew him. He is depicted on the northern wall of the 48th Western Hall. He is shown as a king with a little model of a walled city in one hand, while the other hand he raises in blessing. I wanted to seize hold of him and say to him, in another world you are a king, noble and good, I have seen it. But I hesitated a moment too long, and he disappeared into the crowd. So yeah, he's using the statues, I guess, once he's entered into quote unquote, the real world or our world as a reference point almost, like to help him continue to make sense of the world around him. He recognizes that a lot of these statues he saw in the halls, in our world, we might say, oh, they were tropes of people. They were ideas of people. And now he can see them living out in real life. And perhaps for him, it's working a little in reverse too. He's surrounded by a lot of things that are very foreign to him, but actually he can anchor himself at the reference point of knowing like, oh, I know you before.
Yeah, so in a sense, if we use this to kind of understand like what is real for his character, part of it is related to memory and these reference points. It's very important to his current sense of self and his current worldview and his current understanding of belonging that he does not have any memory of being Matthew Rose Sorensen before he entered the house. All he knows about that previous person is what he has read in his old journals. So what is real to him is what he knows and remembers. To him, the labyrinth in many ways feels more real because that's what has everything he knows. And that's where he feels more like himself in a way. Like, once he's in the real world, he says to himself, I am not home, I am here. Right? So he thinks of the house as home, and this is this other place that he has to go, because that's where the other people are. And he's using the labyrinth and his connection with the statues and his knowledge of the statues and his experience of that place to sort of construct who he is and what things mean and what matters, right? So like, we might go in the reverse order, right? The example of the old man and the king, right? We might look at the king and say, oh, that looks like my grandpa or whatever. That looks like that guy I saw in the park, right? So we think of the man as the original and the statue as the new thing. But Piranesi, it's the reverse, because what he knows is the statue. So he's understanding this new thing, this man, from the perspective of his experience and connection to the statue. And so depending on which direction you're going and what you remember and what you know, the meaning of the world kind of changes, including his own name. Because the name of Matthew Rose Sorensen is no longer tied to any memories or experiences, it's just kind of a symbol of this other person who people think he is. It's just words. The transitioning between those two places is where we really see like how he's constructing his reality. And it creates some conflict, actually, with the other people he interacts with.
Yeah, I found it interesting and very almost heartwarming in a way when Matthew Rose Sorensen, or when Piranesi is, whatever, when our narrator returns, he goes and finds a man who also had previously been imprisoned in the labyrinth. However, this man, no one else believed him, right? So this man was kind of told, you're crazy, you had a mental breakdown, like, I don't believe you. But our narrator finds this man and is kind of like, I believe you and I will take you there. So they go back together. The other man kind of wants to stay there, and the narrator is like, you're not equipped to stay here, but I understand why you want to be here. Mm-hmm. And if I ever decide to come back, I'll bring you with me. But for now, we need to go back. And there's this, it's kind of this beautiful moment of like recognizing that like both of these people have more memories from that time than they do of the real world. And so going back is like a comfort, even if it was their prison, even if they originally didn't want to be there, when they first got trapped, but they've lost those memories. And we even see it with Raphael. The narrator kind of makes her promise, like, don't you disappear. Like, we can't keep going around rescuing each other. Because she is also like, oh, it's like quiet here and there's solace and it can be a very beautiful space, but it's dangerous because of that memory loss. But yeah, it's real for the narrator and this other survivor because they have the memory of it. And I think that also leads into the next thing we want to talk about, where what is considered real is also whatever is shared, whatever is like a shared experience. The world of the labyrinth is very real, but no one believes it. And Raphael even kind of apologizes to the narrator at the end and says, I'm so sorry, we'll never be able to prove what happened to you. Like, Ketterly will never be held responsible. The prophet will never be held responsible because no one else thinks this actually exists, but like, I believe you. And another person coming into the labyrinth who is not trying to manipulate him, someone who's on his side, has to come in and confirm, like, you're right, this is real. You're not crazy. However, we need to get you out of here.
I feel like this idea of the world, is this place real or not, comes up against this sort of Western obsession with the objective, representable reality. Something that's very common is to sort of dismiss people's experiences because they can't quote unquote prove it, right? Because it's something that happens in their body that's maybe not transferable or whatever. There's a very famous disability theorist called Susan Sontag writes a lot about pain. And now very interesting to me that the author had an undiagnosable crippling illness for many years, because that is a lot of what Susan Sontag talks about, of like the experience of not being believed when you're in pain, or because it's invisible and no one else can see it, and it leads to all these different sort of cultural ways of dealing with it, making meaning out of it. So in this particular case, Piranesi has to contend with the fact that no one's gonna believe him. But luckily he has Raphael, right? He has her and this other guy who he can help, who was also trapped there, to just have a moment where you're like, hey, that thing that happened to me was real and I didn't make it up. My experiences are valid and all that kind of stuff, right? To have someone to kind of mirror that for you, because he now has to walk through a world that's totally different and has totally different frames of references. And if he references anything from his previous experience, people are gonna want to like lock him up or something. We see an example of that conflict when Raphael first appears in the labyrinth. And it's actually really interesting because she believes that it's real, right? Because she's physically there. She's experiencing it, but she doesn't have the memory loss yet. And so their understanding of what is around them is quite different. And so they have a conversation about what's real and what's not real. I think you have a quote for that.
So Raphael plays back a recording of a conversation that she had with Lawrence Arnsales, the prophet. It's basically giving that evidence, that proof of why Raphael came for him. Like, I'm trying to find Matthew Rose Sorensen, and then she's like, and then I ended up here, and it was actually real. So this is their discussion afterwards. The narrator says, The other world has different things in it. Words such as Manchester and police station have no meaning here because those things do not exist. Words such as river and mountain do have meaning, but only because those things are depicted in the statues. I suppose that these things must exist in the older world. In this world, the statues depict things that exist in the older world. Yes, said Raphael. Here you can only see a representation of a river or a mountain. But in our world, the other world, you can see the actual river and the actual mountain. This annoyed me. I do not see why you say I can only see a representation in this world, I said with some sharpness. The word only suggests a relationship of inferiority. You make it sound as if the statue was somehow inferior to the thing itself. I do not see that that is the case at all. I would argue that the statue is superior to the thing itself, the statue being perfect, eternal, and not subject to decay. Sorry, said Raphael. I didn't mean to disparage your world. There was a silence. So this is where we get like a very kind of explicit introduction or explicit conversation about what is real versus what is representation. And I think this is kind of a core, almost core theme or maybe even core thesis of the book, is that when we think of what is a representation, what is more real, what is better, there's some conflict with what we actually mean and what we actually experience. And I think what I really love too is Raphael is the first one to say sorry. You know, she's the one that's like, oh, you're right. Like, I didn't mean to disparage your world. Like, I understand now that we see things differently. Julie and I got into this whole conversation. I'm excited to like talk about a bit here as well, as far as like when we think of like art, we have this idea that like the original is more important. The original is more perfect. You brought up the example of demos, like music demos. So like even though the recorded and released version is the official one, there's often this prominence put on the demo because it was the original one. It was the first idea. It was the first recording. Even if the artist is like, but it became better over time because I perfected it. I got more opinions on it. I got more input. I had, you know, more money and more time to like make it better. We'll still be like, but this was the original demo. This was the first time it was recorded. And similarly, we do that with things like photographs. Like, oh, is it better to have a photograph or is it better to have the real thing? And then sometimes it's like, well, is that even an important question? If you have the most beautiful picture of the Grand Canyon, but you've never been there, does that make it any inferior of something to look at? You know, like, what does that mean? And yeah. Then it gets a little trippy.
Yeah, I feel like that conversation is such a good articulation of like Raphael doesn't even realize what she's saying, but Piranesi points it out because has a totally new worldview and totally reshaped sense of what's real and what matters and all this kind of stuff. And Raphael is making a very solid distinction between the original and the representation. And she sees the original as much more important and better, right? So the actual mountain and the actual river are better than the statue of the mountain and the river, and that they are completely separate entities, and that there's a value judgment there, right? And she doesn't even realize in the moment that that's what she's saying, but Piranesi's like, hey, now, don't talk shit about my statues. They're my friends. Like, they're amazing. Look at them, you know? Yeah, for me, it felt like that was one of the indirect purposes, central themes of this book, was like leading us to question and investigate our own understandings of like truth and reality, because this book is written about the English academic system, which has been such a prominent like controller, arbiter of truth and reality for several centuries. You know what I mean? It prioritizes a certain type of knowing and a certain type of understanding, and like creates those hierarchies of what is real and what is most important and all this kind of stuff, including the English literary canon, which we talk about all the time, you know, deciding what books are important and what books are not. This book really puts that way of seeing under a lot of scrutiny just by virtue of having this guy who doesn't remember it. He has some of the practices of it, you know, in the way that he's exploring his home, but he doesn't remember it. And so, you know, we have to ask ourselves, like, why is the idea that, like, a statue is the thing it represents or it can be more than one thing at the same time, or it can be equal to the thing it represents, but a different kind, or whatever. Why is that considered so fundamentally wrong by everyone that Piranesi encounters, and potentially even us readers? You really have to get into the history of where our sort of American ideology kind of comes from, or the English kind of way of seeing comes from. And so we gotta start way back with Plato's Cave Shadows, where we get some really early traces of dualism, which is just the idea that there is either thing or not thing. There is no in between. Things are separate and opposite. The Cave Shadows is basically, Plato compares human beings to people sitting in a cave with a fire that is projecting these sort of shadows of objects, kind of like they're being backlit. These objects are being backlit by this fire. And so we don't see the original shadows, we see the projections of the shadows on the wall. So think of it as like watching a movie. Basically, we're sitting in a cave, we're watching a movie instead of experiencing the real world. And he says that the representation is not nearly as good as the core essence of the thing itself. And so that's kind of where this idea starts, right? That there's an essence of tableness that is superior to any representation of a table. So we kind of start there. And then during the Enlightenment, they really revered like Greek philosophy, and they wanted to like build on that and took it a step further. So the Enlightenment period was characterized, among many things, by labeling all of the things. They were like, we have to label everything. We have to define in concrete and quote-unquote objective terms what a human is and what a human is not, often for the purposes of slavery and exploitation. You know, if it's not a human, then we can use it. And if it is a human, then we have to treat it with respect. And oh, that would be so terrible. You see a bit of a critique of that in this book as a piece of dark academia, where we have a researcher using a person for his own means, and he refuses to get his hands dirty because he has this sort of loftier, higher goal. But because Piranesi is less of a person, he can be used for the quote-unquote greater good.
It's interesting, too, you talk about the desire to label all the things, which is also what we see Piranesi doing in his world. You know, even though, like we said, his linguistic brain is far, the part of him that's like consciously thinking is quite far removed from his idea of any other world. But there's some stuff that's innate, that's like back there, that he hasn't quite questioned why he does the things he does, but he literally has journals where he's going around and cataloging all the statues and like trying to label them all, which is also, I think, a way that he's giving himself work to do, because he's like, well, I'm here.
Yeah. No, it is really interesting that he's like, if he's trying to find a sense of purpose, the job he gives himself to do is very in line with the world that he came from. You know, he was a journalist. He has an index for everything he's ever talked about. Like, he's got
his journals are so organized.
Yeah,
he's quite the index.
Know. It's really impressive. Mine are just by date, maybe, you know.
I just have to think really hard, like, what color journal was I using when I was thinking about that? And then I have to go, like, dig through all my journals to find it.
Exactly.
Yeah. An index. How helpful.
Part of me wonders if, like, the sort of marriage of the kind of animism with some of the holdover qualities and values and practices that he brought from his old life, the sort of marriage of those two things might be be presented as an alternative, a kind of research that is not harmful or exploitative. I highly doubt that's the intent. But it's an interesting, something that I thought of.
Based on your context and the things that you think about, it made you think about it.
Because I have spent a lot of 2022 thinking about ethical research practices. It's like night and day, I think, ethical research practices. So the Enlightenment then had a sort of concurrent impact with the religious world in debates about communion in Christianity. It's where you eat the body and blood of Jesus or whatever. And there are a bunch of debates about how literal that is. Victoria, you actually know a lot more about this than me.
Yeah. So as Julie and I were walking down our idea, like breaking down our thinking around how Western thinking has developed in a way that kind of makes it so that in this book we have characters that are like, it's not real enough, I can't see it, I can't test it, therefore I don't believe you. It made me think a lot about like the centuries-long debate around symbolism within Christian religiosity, especially in like Catholic Protestant spaces. One of the big arguments was whether or not this body and blood of Christ was actually present in the bread and the wine that's used in these church settings. And there's a million different interpretations of exactly how that happens. But there became also this fixation on arguing exactly how it happens, right? Instead of acknowledging. I mean, there's a lot of people that will still say, we acknowledge it as a mystery, we do not understand. But then there's this like Enlightenment thinking that's like, but we must understand, we must label the things. Yeah, there's also around this time, this the Reformation and the emergence of Protestantism, this continued debate around iconography. So these are like pictures of religious figures. And there's this kind of like hardline stance and a lot of Protestantism of not worshiping the, quote, fake statue or image because that statue is not God. And it can be really reductive often. And also, in my opinion, quite contradictory in these beautiful churches that have, a representation of a cross. And then there's like this like very stern, like, no, but like the art is not in fact the thing we worship, and then assuming that anyone who does have the art is in fact worshiping the art, and then the people who do have the art saying we do not worship it, the art is simply a means to which we can worship more strongly. I don't know, I'm getting messy here.
I find it very funny that like there's the contradiction of saying, if you have an all-powerful God, that God kind of must be everywhere. But it's not in this statue, because fuck this statue, specifically. I'm just like, okay, I guess. Like, like a lot of religions don't, not that we're experts in a lot of religions, but there's less of a strict division that Christianity didn't originally have, I don't think. Over time, they sort of developed this idea that like things can only be one thing and nothing else, because otherwise it's too complicated. And if you believe that a thing is a different thing, then you should be killed, which is wild. Like, we're gonna murder you for something that's in your head that we don't like.
To bring it back to the book, too.
Yes.
We have this character, Matthew Rose Sorensen, who is researching and trying to understand outsider thinking. So thinking that is like beyond the approved upon limits of academia, which is what the prophet and the other are doing, researching something that was beyond what is accepted. And it was really kind of like mind-bendy to think about, where you have these really deplorable people who are unlawfully imprisoning others in order to conduct their research. But they're not wrong. Like, they're wrong about how they're going about it, but they're not wrong that this other pocket universe exists and that you can get there. And so these outsiders who are deemed heretics, who are deemed outside of academia, they're not wrong. They're just not going about it in a good way. And I've recently listened to the podcast Heaven's Gate. And so I was thinking a lot about cults because the prophet especially, he kind of has this cult following around him, right? He's got people that will who have disappeared because they've, followed him so closely, which really means they ended up in the labyrinth and never made it out again. Yeah, the destructiveness is ultimately, and I think what this book is highlighting, the destructiveness isn't around this idea that there's another place. The destructiveness is these humans using other humans for their own academic research that ends up destroying the minds and often the lives of the people who followed them. And so, yeah, I think it's more of a critique on how we treat outsiders and people in power in research worlds, like what they do with that power, more so than we shouldn't believe anyone who says there's another world because that's crazy. It's like, well, maybe we should just watch out what they do.
I feel like it's very telling that what the academic world objects to is not his research methods. They don't like that he thinks certain things. That's what they object to. But they don't object to his practices until someone dies. That's how far it has to go for them to be like, you probably shouldn't have done that. Maybe we should, I don't know, arrest you or something, I guess. Like, he was not a good person in how he conducted his work and how he treated his fellows before that, but they didn't like his idea. It's just interesting. You don't like that they're believing a certain thing, but like, what are they doing? What are you doing? You know, what are they what are they doing with those ideas? Because it seems like, you know, Piranesi takes the knowledge of the labyrinth and tries to do something good with it. So, to continue our Western thinking / representation timeline, moving out of the religious era, we get into the linguistics era, was trying to make a map of the human mind to demonstrate how everything has like a one-to-one correlation kind of thing, and that there's a particular way of thinking that everyone has. And they were so determined to find this kind of objective structure because, you know, they thought that European academics were the arbiter of objectivity, right? But then it all kind of fell apart because that's obviously not how humans work. And so then the response was just kind of like, screw it, nothing's real, nothing means anything. We really swung really hard in the opposite direction.
And then we had Derrida.
Yes.
And we were all like, our minds broke, and that's when everyone said they hated literary theory class in college. Everything doesn't mean anything because it only points away from itself. Yeah. It is not something, it is what it is not. And you're just like, I don't know what any of those words mean. And you're like, I don't either, but I just said them thinking I knew what I meant. And then you like you just have to stop talking because you realize words don't mean anything.
Yeah, you just fall down this rabbit hole of like nothingness and chaos. As if those are the only two options, right? You either have objectivity or complete chaos. There's nothing in between. And so language can't represent ideas or things at all. Pictures can't represent the things at all. Like everything's separate and nothing's connected, and it's stupid. It's really irritating. It's not a functional way of thinking, but it still lingers in a lot of how people talk and how people see the world. And like, you know, if you're feeling particularly dramatic or depressed or whatever, you know what I mean? You'll see some of those ideas come out. But we do still have this sort of lingering desperation for the real or the original, right? I feel like millennial hipsters that was like the core tenet of it, right? Was like, we got to have the real and the original, and like, we got to get vinyl back. And, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting to as we kind of meander our way through Western thinking, I kind of acknowledge where like, okay, so we had Plato and eventually reacted to Plato, and we brought those ideas back with the Enlightenment, and then we reacted against that in our religious settings, we reacted against it in our literary settings, and then we were like, actually nothing means anything, and we were like just swinging back and forth, but picking up all these ideas along the way that influence the way we think now. You know, like in one breath I might utter something that is postmodern and you know, Kantian at the same time, and be like, I don't know, I think all of it, and I think none of it, and I'm yeah.
Exactly. And you can't quite untangle any particular thing because it's all tied together in your world and your experience. And like what we're swimming in now is all the remnants of these ideas, where now, again, we have this idea that there's a truth and an original version that is true, and then we have all these sort of less real things, and that there is some kind of objectivity that's important, and all this sort of stuff. And it has a big impact on how we experience reading the book.
Yeah, so like we said, we kind of carry all these ideas with us. And our characters in a book also come from this Western English academic background. And so they carry a lot of these ideas with them. Even Matthew Rowe Sorensen had these ideas before he forgot them and then rebuilt his understanding of the world around him. And this also is like this very meta experience as we read the book, because we are also trying to make meaning of the book. So because I'm a Western American reader, I'm bringing in my own culture and context to the book. Julie and I realized we were doing this a lot when Julia's like, this is the idea I have. It's from anthropology. And I'm like, here's the idea I have. This is from like Protestant Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And like realizing that we cannot escape our own worldviews, especially when we're dropped into this beautifully written landscape where there is no reference point. You literally have the words on the page because you get sentences like this when you first start the book. When the moon rose in the 3rd northern hall, I went to the 9th vestibule. Entry for the 1st day of the 5th month in the year the albatross came to the southwestern halls. Like, what the fuck? I read the first page like 4 times. I was like, I have to be missing something. I have no context. I have nowhere to land. I was like, I remember an albatross from like, what was that poem we read, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and then I was like Googling Ancient Mariner and like Coleman to like figure out what the fuck he was writing about. And I'm like, is it the same thing? And then finally, in like the first few pages, I get this reference to a faun, and the narrator has a memory of like a wintry woods and the faun speaking to a girl. And I was like, oh, we're in Narnia. And I spent like 17 pages of the book thinking I was in Narnia. And like that, because that's my reference points. Yeah. Susanna Clarke gives us this little hint of Narnia, and she even, you know, quotes the C.S. Lewis book in her epigraph. So I was like, oh, that's where we are. But no, we weren't. We were none of those places. Yeah, I think understanding the lens that we bring as a reader, this book does a really incredible thing of like flipping it on us to make us aware of the lens we bring, or maybe unaware until we speak with a friend about it and realize, oh wait, your experience of this book was different than my experience of this book. Yeah. Tell me about your experience. Oh, I don't know if I like that. Oh, but I can see why that's true. Oh, wow, maybe I was wrong. And have that kind of realization that we are all just making sense of the world around us with the context we have. And sometimes you need a friend to be like, girl, your reading is not wrong, but it's not right. Or I can see what you're saying, but maybe not. To remind us that like we need the people around us to, like that quote, perhaps even people you like and admire immensely can make you see the world in ways you rather not. Yeah.
And it's really fascinating to be dropped in a world that we have no reference point for, which Piranesi knows intimately. But we are also reading a book written by a person in our world who then makes references that we understand as readers that Piranesi does not. So we simultaneously know more and less than he does. And it's a trip. Like that example of the Narnia reference. It's something you latch on to because you're like, oh, I get that. That's something I know. You know, but Piranesi doesn't know. He doesn't know that he's thinking of Narnia. That's what the statue of the faun made him think of. But then when he talks about the vestibules and the house and the whatever, you're just like, what? It's also interesting because there's so much we don't understand. We approach it like a mystery in a way. It's not necessarily to the main character, you know, like, I don't know if the main character knows he's in a mystery, but it feels like that to us because there's so much we don't understand. And so we're asking all these questions, like, what is the house? Why is it here? How do people get here? Why is he talking to the statues? What do they mean? And all the while he's using language and experience that we just do not have access to. We have to spend a lot of time with him to kind of figure out how his brain works. And we're asking all these questions and like he doesn't answer them because he doesn't care, or he already knows an answer, but it's not an answer that's satisfactory to us. Right? So when he says the beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. That's how the first section ends. And we're like, what does that mean? And he's like, it means exactly what it says it means, you know? He's satisfied with, through his way of knowing, he has an explanation for everything in his world. But we aren't satisfied with it because we're coming from something else. So throughout the book, you're sort of constantly drawing these boundaries around the story to try and figure out what the rules are. What are the rules of this story? What are the rules of this world? Trying to orient yourself.
Yeah, so I feel like when I was reading the first, 100 pages, I was just making these mental notes of like, okay, what do we know about this world? What do I know about this narrator? I'm like, okay, there's someone else here called the Other. Easy name. We know. There's another. Okay, it looks like there's bones of people here. So there were other people, and they've been dead a long time. so long that this main character doesn't remember it. We don't yet know the character has lost his memory, though, and so his sense of time and how long things have been is, like, not accurate. I'm also really curious, something that's not answered in the book, is did Piranesi interact with any of those people before they died?
Mm.
And he doesn't remember anymore. Is that why he has a reverence for the dead? Is that why there was a set of bones that were, like, fish wired together? Did he do that and then forgot he did that? Because who else has been there to do anything? It's been him for, like, 6 years.
That's a good point. I didn't think of that.
We realize over time that the narrator is unreliable. Not only is he not giving us information, but he's also unreliable. And so I think I was cataloging these informations. Okay, there's tides, there's water, there's sea, there's sky, there's building. Okay, he's getting resources from somewhere. The other seems to have more resources than he does. So the other has some sort of connection somewhere. But I don't think Piranesi's ever thought to ask about it, because his explanation that's satisfactory for him is, oh, the house has blessed him.
Yeah.
And you're like, I don't know about that, Piranesi. I think I would beg to differ. He seems to have a hookup. So yeah, that as the reader, you have that experience. At least I had that experience of just trying to catalog things, almost as Piranesi's cataloging things, to, like, wrap my head around it. And for Susanna Clarke, it's a very brilliant way to, like, introduce us to the world without having the narrator unrealistically over-explaining things, you know? Because he's just writing this for himself.
Yeah. Do you think he wants to know more than what he currently knows? Because, like, we have this drive forward of, like, we keep reading because we want to know what's happening. And it feels like the whole situation is kind of forced upon him. But once he has a kernel of information and he gets used to the idea, he does kind of want... He keeps reading, he keeps looking. So there's this kind of contradictory part of him where, like, some of him does want to answer questions for himself, but a big part of him doesn't. And he's sort of satisfied with the worldview that he's created. And it seems like he kind of regrets what he ends up knowing. I don't know.
It's complicated, right? Because there's this part of him that keeps forgetting.
Mm-hmm.
And then you wonder if he wants to keep forgetting, because he finds the pages of his journal all torn up. My thinking is that he read those before, was so disturbed by it that he tore it up and threw it out, and therefore was choosing to forget again. Maybe he didn't know he was going to forget again, but he just, like, couldn't bear it, so he, like, tore it up. I don't think the other found his journal, because I think if the other found his journal, he would have, like, been more forceful to remove that information. So I do think it's kind of one of those aspects where he doesn't have someone else to make him wonder why he does things.
Yeah.
Like, I find myself doing this sometimes where I'm going about my day and I'm doing something and my partner will look over and he'll be like, oh, why are you doing it that way? And I was like, I don't know. This is just the way I was doing it. Why did you choose to do it that way? And if no one questions you, you're just like, I don't know. It's just what I did.
Yeah.
So I think maybe, yeah, not having an outsider. I think the other does influence him a lot because the other has his own agenda. And so he's sending Piranesi out on these, like, small missions to gather intel. And Piranesi likes to be helpful. And so he continues to do it.
Yeah, that's true. He's not completely isolated. Because he's got the remnants, sort of the muscle memory of his former life. And he's got this ongoing influence from the other, which he does resist often. We get the sense that he comes back to him and is like, I'm not going to do projects for you anymore. And it happens, like, once a year or something. So I guess with the constant forgetting, it's hard to tell what is a matter of choice. I just find that conflict very fascinating. You know what I mean? In the conflict of interest, even, of, like, what we versus the narrator want out of the progression of the story, even, you know, what we want to know. And, you know, a lot of readers would get to the end and be like, you didn't answer all of my questions. I'm unhappy with this book. It's very understandable to be dissatisfied with it, but that's also not really what this book is. There's a very strong clash of cultures, really. And it's also part of, going back to what we said at the beginning, is part of what makes this book so impossible to communicate to people. Because you just have to experience it for yourself. There's something untranslatable about the process. You have to come at it with the same openness and ignorance as Piranesi.
Yeah, it's funny to me that, like, if I was the only person who had read this book and I was like, Julia, you gotta read this book. It's like, I can't even explain it. It's this incredible thing. And you're like, if you and I weren't friends that read books together, you would probably be like, okay, cool, whatever. Like, I don't really believe you. Like, why can't you tell me what it's about? And I'm like, I don't know. There's like a sea and there's statues and there's this tide that comes in and there's this guy who lives in the house and there's the other. And you'd be like, okay, cool. Like, nice. And then you have like this gaslighting experience of like, did I actually read this book? Yeah, there is that kind of funny experience of like a book about not being able to explain something sufficiently to make others believe you is also a book that like defies a genre definition, that defies a short synopsis. Like every short synopsis I've read of this book is so light on the details because they're like, we can't say anything without giving it away.
And so you get so frustrated being like, just tell me what this book is.
Yeah, and I think some of the reviews I was reading, like on Storygraph, the negative reviews were usually around people who were like, I couldn't get into this. It was so confusing for like the first 100 pages, like, or I really liked the book, but like, wow, those first 100 pages were rough. And like, no shade to them. Like, if I didn't know to be prepared to dig into something really weird, I also would have been like, why do I care about this book?
Yeah.
I think some of my favorite parts of the book are right at the end, and it's the narrator's realization, coming to terms with what's happened to him. And as a reader, we're left with some of these pretty profound thoughts or ideas. And for example, Piranesi hasn't really been around other people in his memory. And so going to a world where there's like more than 70 people. Yeah. I love that line. It's so funny when he's like, oh, I picked a number that would be outrageous. And he's like, like more than 70 people. And Raphael's like, yeah, there's more than 70 people. He's like, have you counted? Have you counted? But we have these last thoughts of like, yeah, what does it mean to be around other people? It leaves me with a sense of like, I mean, it's not the happiest of thoughts, right? You know, it's not
really a happy ending.
Yeah, not really a happy ending either. But it definitely makes you sit and think. And it reminds me how much I enjoy reading. Because even though Susanna Clarke is someone that, you know, I admire immensely and like, she reminds me that there's like some really messy things in the world and that things aren't always what they seem. A reminder that coming to a book with like openness and leaving my projections and ideas on the side, or at least acknowledging when I'm bringing my context into the book, can help me see things in a different way.
And knowing that everyone is approaching your sort of shared space with very different contexts that might be untranslatable, but that doesn't mean that you can't communicate. A lot of thoughts to be left with. Book is not for the faint of heart.
For those who enjoyed reading this book, what would you recommend they check out next?
I'm going to recommend 2 books that I have not read that I want to. Susanna Clarke's first book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, sounds great. I know it's very long, but I want to tackle it someday. And then a dark academia book set in Oxford, which feels relevant, that I'm very excited to get into because Victoria bought it for me, called Babel by R.F. Kuang.
I'm also excited to read it. When I read the like synopsis, I was like, ooh, this is a book for us. My other recommendations for a slice of magical realism, The Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki, I would recommend. Also deals a lot with mental illness and loneliness, which I think are, you know, similar themes in Piranesi. I was also often reminded of The Subtle Knife, which is the second book of his Dark Materials series by Philip Pullman. If you're into, you know, like multiple universe kind of experiences, like the mix of religion and science and fantasy, that series is interesting. And then lastly, I watched the movie Castaway, the one with Tom Hanks. Yeah, like a couple days after I finished reading this book. And it's so different, but it's also similar of like a person who's alone and what do they do to survive. Okay, Currently Obsessed, our final segment of the show where we talk about the things that are bringing us joy.
Yeah, Alice in Borderland, Season 2, baby! So good. That's all.
Vern and I started watching Welcome to Chippendales. It's the new Hulu show starring Camille Nanjiani. It's ridiculous and great. I'm very excited to watch more of it. We watched like 2 episodes until it was like midnight the other night, and we're like, we should go to bed, but we really want to watch another. So we'll watch it this week. And then I just listened to the audiobook version of I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. And wow, girl, I know everyone's talking about it, but I know why everyone's talking about it. Jeanette McCurdy is an incredible writer. She had an extremely difficult life that she has written about with so much humor and warmth. And I think, like, stylistically, one of the most interesting memoirs I've read of late, especially by a celebrity. I'm a big fan. I'm excited to see what else she writes, because she said she's got like a novel and some like a short story collection or a poetry collection or something in the works. But it's a dark one. It's heavy stuff. That was the book I listened to in the dark when I was recovering from the stomach flu.
Oh, cheerful stuff right there.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at Book Club with JV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasney provides us with project management support. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.